In 1879, a 16-year-old boy left his father's farm bound for Detroit. At a time when the only means of transportation were trains or horse carriages, and the first automobiles were mostly seen as racing machines for the rich, this boy would later open a car company that would change the course of the automobile industry to what we know today. 35 years later, after his arrival in Detroit, half of all the cars on Earth were carrying his name. And that boy, Henry Ford, would become one of the wealthiest men in American history. This is that story. And from a young age, he became very interested in mechanics. This curiosity for machines led him to study every piece of machinery he came across. At the age of 12, his father gifted him a pocket watch, and after playing around with its movements, he learned how to take it apart and put it back together in a matter of minutes, as well as the watches of his friends and relatives. He later gained a reputation as a watch repairman and began fixing watches for people in the neighborhood. When Henry turned 13, he came across a steam engine for the first time in his life during a school trip to one of Detroit's companies, and that's when his passion for mechanics became an obsession. And for the next few years, it became his new hobby. By the time he was 15, he had constructed his first steam engine. Word of Henry's talent reached the district representative of the Westinghouse Engine Company of Schenectady from New York, and so the company hired him. Henry's job was to travel throughout southern Michigan, setting up and servicing Westinghouse steam tractor engines. In the year 1885, Henry met Clara Jane Bryant at a New Year's Eve party and got engaged the following year. As a wedding gift, Henry's father gave his son 40 acres of land, but rather than turning it into a farmland, Henry had other ideas. It wasn't until June 4th, 1896, at exactly 1:30 a.m., when he finally completed his experimental car using a gas engine. He called it the quadricycle. The quadricycle was essentially a crude contraption that consisted of two bicycles placed side by side and was powered by a gasoline engine. While the experiment was successful, it had a few issues of its own. This experimental car had two gears, and neither one was for going in reverse or going forward. But the biggest problem was that it had no cooling system, and so the car was prone to overheating after running for a while. Henry made multiple adjustments to the car, but the most notable one was adding a cooling system to the vehicle. He later sold the vehicle for $200 and used the money for another big project. With the support of the Detroit mayor, Henry began to build his second experimental car and completed it by July 1899. This new car was larger, sturdier, and heavier than the previous one. One morning, Henry took a wealthy lumber merchant by the name of William Murphy for a test drive in his new vehicle. By the time the test drive was finished, William wanted to be part of Henry's business venture. And soon after, they shook hands together, and on August 5th, 1899, the Detroit Automobile Company was born. Unfortunately, the company failed only a year later because of several reasons. Henry's ideas about improving the car he worked on were not in line with the stakeholders' ideas, who were pressuring him to make passenger cars. Another reason was because most of the parts that were required to make his cars were produced by different companies. And as a result of this, whenever a delivery was late, the whole factory had to sit back and wait for the delivery. This slowed production by a significant amount of time. His first car, which he called the delivery wagon, took 6 months to make, and only 20 of them were made during the company's first 2-year existence. As a result of all this, Henry was fired from his position. But even though his first company had failed, he remained optimistic. Failure is simply the opportunity to begin again, this time more intelligently. Henry was actually relieved when he was sacked because there was less pressure on him, and now he could focus on other things. With the support and financial backing of 11 investors, especially a coal dealer from Detroit, Alexander Young Malcolmson, Henry's third company came to life. The company was initially called Ford & Malcolmson Limited, but was later changed to the Ford Motor Company in 1902. After failing in his first 2 attempts, he was determined not to fail again. Ford turned his attention to creating a vehicle that was affordable for the common man. He called it the Model A. For the next 5 years, Henry kept improving the Model A, which was followed by the Model N. But in those 5 years, what really changed wasn't the improvements of his designs, but how they were being made. One of the things Henry learned from his failed businesses was the importance of having one manufacturer responsible for supplying most of the parts he needed to build his cars. And so, he found a machine shop in Detroit to do just that. One day, during a trip to Chicago, Henry witnessed the assembly line concept at a slaughterhouse, and that's when a bright idea came to him. If he could incorporate the same idea into building his cars, he could make more cars in a day. It wasn't until 1906 when the production of the Model N would really first make use of the assembly line, but even then, the assembly line was still a work in progress. However, it did increase the level of production by 5 times, and his new model became the best-selling car in the US. Henry realized he needed a bigger factory to produce over 100 Model Ts a day, and so, in 1910, he built a new plant in Highland Park, Michigan. After several experiments, the assembly line was officially in working order by 1913. This allowed work to be taken to the workers rather than the workers moving in and around the vehicle. The vehicle was pulled down the line, building it step by step, and the new process reduced the time of production from 12 hours to 90 minutes. By 1914, their production rate of over 300,000 vehicles was more than all the cars produced by other car manufacturers combined. Between 1910 to 1916, the number of Model Ts being produced moved from 20,000 to almost 1 million. By then, about half of all the cars on Earth were Fords. Henry had another brilliant game plan that would make him stand out in the automobile market. Every year, the number of the Model T's production output increased, so he reduced the price of the car. In fact, by 1916, the price of the Model T that once sold for $850 was now selling for less than $400. But that wasn't the only brilliant strategy Henry adopted. You see, despite Henry pioneering the age of the automobile in America with the assembly line, a lot of his workers weren't happy with this innovation. Many workers found doing the same thing over and over again boring, and the skilled craftsmen among them found their new job insulting, as they were tasked with just 2 duties instead of building a whole car. As a result, workers began to leave Ford to work for other companies. To combat this, Henry doubled the workers' wage, raising it to $5 a day. Many companies laughed at this move, believing it would quickly bankrupt the company, but it did the opposite. Mechanics from all over the country flew to Detroit in search of higher wages. We believe in making 25,000 men prosperous and contented, rather than following the plan of making a few slave drivers in our multi-millionaire establishments. Not only did Henry Ford increase the wages of the mechanics who now worked for him, but he also gave them an hour off from the number of hours they were required to work. The change in shift allowed Ford to hire a new set of workers for a 3rd shift and create a 24-hour operation. Soon enough, many other car businesses had to do the same in fear of losing their workers to Ford. Henry had changed the business and manufacturing world across the USA. There is one rule for the industrialist, and that is, make the best quality goods possible, at the lowest cost possible, paying the highest wages possible. In 1919, Henry Ford grew tired of the interference from other investors in the company and decided to buy them all out. The result was several millionaires in Detroit, but it also made Henry Ford the sole owner of the largest automobile company in the world. Later, Henry made Edsel Ford, his 26-year-old son, the president of his company, but it was Henry who really ran the show. However, absolute power over the company came with a price that even the richest man in America couldn't ignore. The new Model A was released in 1927, but this new car was no longer produced at Highland Park, but at a bigger factory along the Rogue River in Michigan. In his new factory, Henry wanted to include all the steps involved in the manufacturing process, from refining raw materials to the final assembly of the automobile, which he accomplished. It became the world's largest factory, making steel, glass, tires, and other components that went into building the cars. However, Ford's one-man control over the decision-making was no longer the formula for success, and by 1936, Ford Motor Company had fallen to third place in the US market behind General Motors and the Chrysler Corporation. Even with Henry's latest innovative design of the V8 engine, it wasn't enough. Things only went from bad to worse, and with the rise of the Great Depression, Ford was forced to lay off workers and lower his rates. In 1943, Henry's son died of stomach cancer, and so he kept running the company for 2 more years before turning over his control of the Ford Motor Company to his grandson, Henry II. Henry retired to his estate and later died of a cerebral hemorrhage on April 7, 1947. Life is a series of experiences, each one of which makes us bigger, even though sometimes it is hard to realize this. For the world was built to develop character, and we must learn that the setbacks and grieves which we endure help us in our marching onward. Today, Ford Motor Company owns a market cap of around $70 billion and remains as one of the biggest car companies in the world.